In the dead of night, a merchant awoke to find his wife strangled in their bed. 7 times this happened. 7 husbands, 7 corpses, and standing in the shadows, invisible to mortal eyes, was something ancient, something burning with jealous rage. They called him Asmodeus, the demon who destroys love itself. But here's what the ancient texts never told you about why he kills and what he actually wants from humanity. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why this demon story is far more disturbing than you ever imagined. What if I told you that one of the most powerful demons in existence started as something completely different? That the creature known for lust, wrath, and destroying marriages was once connected to divine powers? Asmodeus isn't just another demon in the catalog of evil. He's a being whose origins stretch back thousands of years, appearing in Jewish texts, Christian demonology, Persian mythology, and even Islamic traditions. He's the demon who commanded 72 legions of lesser demons. The fallen angel who could see through time itself. The creature whose very presence could drive humans to madness, violence, and uncontrollable desire. Today, we're diving deep into the true story of Asmodeus, and I promise you, everything you thought you knew about this demon is about to change. We're going to explore his real origins, the terrifying powers he wielded, the famous victims he tormented, and the shocking reason why scholars believe his story was told in the first place. This isn't just mythology. This is a window into how ancient cultures understood temptation, jealousy, and the darker corners of human nature. Let's go back to where it all began, because Asmodeus didn't start in a vacuum. To understand this demon, we need to travel back over 2,000 years to ancient Persia, to a religion that most people have never heard of, but that shaped everything that came after. Zoroastrianism. This was one of the world's first monotheistic religions, and it had a sophisticated understanding of good and evil. In Zoroastrian belief, the universe was a battleground between Ahura Mazda, the god of light and truth, and Angra Mainyu, the spirit of destruction. And serving under Angra Mainyu were 6 archdemons called the Devas. One of them was named Aeshma Daeva, which translates to demon of wrath or fury demon. Aeshma was the embodiment of violence, rage, and destructive anger. He incited humans to war, murder, and senseless brutality. In the ancient Zoroastrian texts, he was described as wielding a bloody spear, driving men to kill their brothers, and whispering thoughts of vengeance into peaceful minds. He was chaos personified, the force that turned reason into madness. And when the Jewish people encountered Persian culture during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century before the Common Era, they absorbed this figure into their own developing angelology and demonology. But something fascinating happened during that cultural exchange. The demon of wrath became something more complex, something that spoke to deeper human fears. Enter the Book of Tobit, a text that's part of the Catholic and Orthodox biblical canon, but considered apocryphal by most Protestants and not included in the Jewish Tanakh. This is where we meet Asmodeus as a fully formed character in Jewish tradition, and this is where his association with lust and destroyed marriages begins. The story is simple on the surface, but deeply disturbing when you examine it closely. There was a young woman named Sarah, daughter of Raguel, living in the city of Ecbatana. She was beautiful, virtuous, and faithful. By all accounts, she should have lived a blessed life. Instead, she became the victim of a demonic obsession that would destroy 7 lives. Sarah was married 7 times. On each wedding night, before the marriage could be consummated, the husband died. Not from natural causes, not from illness or accident. They were murdered by Asmodeus, who was described as being in love with Sarah himself. Imagine the horror of this situation. 7 men, on what should have been the happiest night of their lives, were suddenly struck down. 7 families are devastated. And Sarah, innocent Sarah, blamed by her community, mocked by her servants, considered cursed. The text tells us she prayed for death, so great was her suffering. She wanted to die rather than be responsible for another death. But here's where the story gets interesting, because it reveals something crucial about how Asmodeus operates. He wasn't just killing randomly. He was possessive, jealous, consumed by desire for something he could never have. This wasn't mindless demonic destruction. This was personal. This was emotional. And that makes him far more terrifying than a simple monster. Because we can understand jealousy. We can understand obsessive desire. We've all felt echoes of those emotions, even if we'd never act on them. Asmodeus represents those dark feelings taken to their ultimate, destructive conclusion. The story continues with a young man named Tobias, the son of Tobit, who was sent on a journey guided by the archangel Raphael in disguise. When Tobias learned he was destined to marry Sarah, he was understandably terrified. 7 dead husbands. How could he expect to survive? But Raphael gave him secret knowledge, instructions on how to defeat Asmodeus. On the wedding night, Tobias was to burn the heart and liver of a fish, and the smoke would drive the demon away. The text describes this moment vividly. As the smoke rose, Asmodeus fled to the remotest parts of Egypt, where Raphael pursued him and bound him hand and foot. Now, why Egypt? This detail is significant because Egypt, in Jewish tradition, represented the place of exile, slavery, and spiritual darkness. It was the land they had escaped from, the place of bondage. Sending Asmodeus to Egypt was symbolic, banishing him to a place associated with captivity and restriction. And being bound there by an archangel meant he could no longer act freely in the world. But the text doesn't say he was destroyed, just bound. And that's a critical distinction, because it means the threat still exists, restrained but not eliminated. As Judaism evolved and Christianity emerged, Asmodeus's character continued to develop and grow more complex. By the medieval period, he had become one of the most prominent figures in Christian demonology, appearing in grimoires, theological texts, and popular legends. But his nature had expanded beyond the jealous demon of the Book of Tobit. He became associated with a wide range of sins and possessed powers that made him one of the most dangerous entities in the infernal hierarchy. In the Testament of Solomon, a text probably written in the 1st to 3rd centuries of the Common Era, we get a completely different picture of Asmodeus. King Solomon, in this account, was building the temple in Jerusalem when he encountered demons who were interfering with the construction. Using a magical ring given to him by the archangel Michael, Solomon was able to summon and bind demons, forcing them to work on the temple. When Asmodeus appeared before Solomon, the king questioned him about his origins, his powers, and his nature. Asmodeus revealed things that don't appear in any other text. He claimed to be the offspring of a human woman and an angel, making him a Nephilim, one of those mysterious beings mentioned briefly in Genesis as the children of the sons of God and the daughters of men. He told Solomon that his mission was to plot against newlyweds, to prevent them from consummating their marriages, to cause marital discord, and to drive men to madness through lust. He could scatter men across the world, cause divorces, and inspire sexual deviance. He claimed power over the constellation of the Bear, suggesting astrological influence. And perhaps most disturbing, he said he could see into the future and the past, giving him knowledge that made him incredibly dangerous. But here's where it gets really interesting. Solomon asked Asmodeus if there was anything that could thwart his power, and the demon admitted that he was driven away by smoke, specifically the smoke from a particular fish's gallbladder burned on wood from a specific tree. This connects directly back to the book of Tobit and Raphael's instructions to Tobias. The consistency across texts suggests these weren't just random stories, but part of a developing theological framework about how demons operate and how they can be resisted. Solomon didn't destroy Asmodeus. Instead, he bound him and forced him to help build the temple, using demonic power for holy purposes. Think about the irony of that. The demon of lust and wrath, compelled to construct the house of God. The creature that destroys marriages, forced to create something sacred. Medieval artists loved depicting this scene, showing Asmodeus in chains, working alongside human laborers, his supernatural strength used for divine purposes against his will. But there's another version of the Solomon story, found in later Jewish folklore and the Talmud, where things go very differently. In this version, Asmodeus tricks Solomon, steals his ring, takes his form, and sits on the throne of Israel while the real Solomon wanders as a beggar. For years, the demon rules in Solomon's place, and no one realizes the switch. Only after immense suffering does Solomon reclaim his identity and his kingdom. This version portrays Asmodeus not just as powerful, but as cunning, capable of fooling an entire nation, even taking the place of the wisest man who ever lived. By the time we get to the 16th and 17th centuries and the great grimoires of ceremonial magic, Asmodeus had reached the peak of his infernal career. In the Ars Goetia, part of the Lesser Key of Solomon, he appears as one of the 72 demons that Solomon supposedly cataloged and bound. But his description had changed again. Now he was said to appear with 3 heads, one of a man, one of a ram, and one of a bull. He had the feet of a rooster and rode a dragon or lion, breathing fire. He carried a lance and a banner. This bizarre composite appearance wasn't random. Each element had a symbolic meaning. The ram represented lust and fertility, connecting to his sexual nature. The bull symbolized wrath and violent strength, linking back to his origins as Aeshma, the fury demon. The man's head showed his intelligence and ability to reason, making him more dangerous than a mindless beast. The rooster's feet suggested pride and combativeness, while the dragon or lion mount emphasized his royal status among demons. He wasn't just a tempter. He was a king, commanding 72 legions, each legion containing between hundreds and thousands of lesser demons. That's an army capable of tormenting millions. Now, you might be wondering why Asmodeus became so prominently associated with lust when his original incarnation as Aeshma was all about wrath. This is where we need to talk about the 7 deadly sins and how medieval Christianity organized its understanding of evil. The concept of the 7 principal sins that lead to all other sins developed gradually through early Christian thought, reaching its mature form by the time of Pope Gregory I in the 6th century. These weren't just random vices. They were considered the root psychological and spiritual disorders that corrupt the soul and lead to damnation. The original list, from the monk Evagrius Ponticus in the 4th century, included 8 evil thoughts: gluttony, lust, greed, sadness, wrath, sloth, vainglory, and pride. Gregory later condensed and revised these into the 7 we know today: pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth. As this system developed, medieval demonologists began associating specific demons with each deadly sin, creating a kind of infernal hierarchy. Satan or Lucifer became associated with pride, Mammon with greed, Beelzebub with gluttony, Leviathan with envy, Belphegor with sloth, and Asmodeus was assigned to lust, while Satan also claimed wrath in some systems. But why assign Asmodeus to lust rather than keeping him solely as a wrath demon? The answer lies in how medieval theologians understood temptation and sin. They recognized that sins rarely exist in isolation. Wrath and lust, in particular, were seen as closely connected. Both involve loss of self-control. Both overwhelm reason with passion. Both can drive people to destroy relationships, families, and communities. A man consumed by lust might become wrathful when rejected. A jealous person, like Asmodeus in the Book of Tobit, combines possessive desire with violent rage. The two sins feed each other. Medieval art depicted Asmodeus in various ways, but certain elements appeared consistently. He was often shown as handsome or seductive in some aspect, able to tempt humans with beauty before revealing his monstrous nature. Other times, he appeared as purely grotesque, a warning about where lust leads. Sometimes he was shown breathing fire, representing the burning nature of desire. Sometimes he held musical instruments, suggesting the seductive arts. And almost always, he was accompanied by naked human figures, representing his victims, the souls corrupted by lust. The Church taught that Asmodeus worked by inflaming natural desires beyond their proper bounds. He didn't create sexuality, which was seen as a gift from God within marriage, but he corrupted it, turning it into an obsession that destroyed souls. He inspired adultery, fornication, and what medieval people called unnatural acts. He broke apart marriages not through direct violence, as in the Book of Tobit, but through temptation, making husbands and wives unfaithful to each other. He made people slaves to their appetites, unable to think of anything but physical gratification. But the really insidious aspect of Asmodeus's work, according to these theologians, was that he made sin attractive. Unlike demons associated with obviously destructive sins like wrath or envy, Asmodeus offered pleasure. He promised fulfillment, excitement, and passion. He made evil look like good, corruption look like joy. And that made him perhaps more dangerous than demons who inspired obviously negative emotions. It's easier to resist something that makes you miserable than something that makes you feel good, at least in the moment. This theological framework influenced not just church teaching, but literature, art, and popular culture for centuries. Asmodeus appeared in medieval morality plays as the tempter who leads young men astray. He showed up in cautionary tales about the dangers of desire. He became a stock character representing sexual sin, instantly recognizable to audiences. Mention Asmodeus, and medieval people immediately understood what was being discussed, what was at stake, and what the consequences might be. Let's talk about what Asmodeus could actually do, according to the various texts and traditions. Because this wasn't just a demon who inspired bad thoughts. He had specific, terrifying abilities that made him a genuine threat in the worldview of people who believed in his existence. Understanding these powers gives us insight into what people feared most and what they thought was the greatest danger to their souls and communities. First, and most obviously, he could inspire overwhelming lust. Not just a natural attraction, but a consuming, irrational desire that overrode judgment and morality. Medieval texts describe him as able to enter dreams, creating fantasies so vivid that people woke unable to think of anything else. He could make people obsess over someone they'd barely met, convinced that this person was their destiny, their missing piece, even when all evidence contradicted this. He could take a healthy interest and transform it into addiction, making someone risk everything, family, reputation, career, for momentary gratification. Second, he could cause impotence and sexual dysfunction, particularly in married couples. This might seem contradictory to his role as a lust demon, but it makes sense within the moral framework. If Asmodeus's goal was to prevent the proper expression of sexuality within marriage while encouraging improper expression outside marriage, then making married couples unable to consummate their union served his purpose. The Book of Tobit makes this explicit. He killed Sarah's husbands before consummation. He wanted to prevent the marriage from being real, from creating the bond that sexuality was supposed to create. Third, he could see the future and the past. This ability, mentioned in the Testament of Solomon, made him valuable and dangerous in equal measure. Magicians who successfully summoned him sought this knowledge, wanting to know what would happen or what had happened in secret. But knowledge from a demon was always suspect, always potentially corrupted by lies or half-truths designed to lead the summoner astray. Asmodeus might tell you true things in a way that causes you to make false conclusions. He might reveal the future, but leave out the crucial detail that would change everything. Fourth, he commanded vast armies of lesser demons. 72 legions, according to the grimoires. Each of these demons could carry out his will, spreading temptation, causing discord, and breaking apart relationships. He wasn't working alone. He had an entire infrastructure of evil at his disposal, an organized system for corrupting humanity. Think of it as a demonic corporation, with Asmodeus as the chief executive, implementing strategies across millions of souls simultaneously. Fifth, he could take different forms, appearing as whatever would be most effective for temptation. To some, he might appear as an attractive stranger. To others, as someone trustworthy who gave seemingly good advice that led somewhere dark. In the Talmudic stories, he could perfectly impersonate King Solomon himself, fooling everyone. This shape-shifting ability meant you could never be entirely certain who you were dealing with, whether that person encouraging you down a particular path had your best interests at heart or was literally a demon in disguise. Sixth, he had power over marriages, specifically the ability to see their weak points and exploit them. He could intensify existing problems, turn small disagreements into bitter fights, and make partners suspicious of each other without cause. He could inspire jealousy, the very emotion that defined him in the Book of Tobit. He could make people feel trapped in their marriages while simultaneously preventing them from finding satisfaction within those marriages, a perfect recipe for misery and sin. And finally, according to some texts, he could cause madness, particularly madness related to obsession and passion. People driven insane by desire, unable to function, unable to think clearly, consumed entirely by fantasy. This was seen as the ultimate endpoint of his influence, when someone gave themselves over so completely to lust that they lost their humanity, becoming more like a beast driven purely by appetite. These weren't just random powers. Each one addressed a specific fear that real people had about their own weakness, their own vulnerability to temptation. The question that haunted medieval Christians was always, how do I resist? How do I know if these thoughts are my own or demonic influence? And if I can't resist, does that mean I'm damned? Throughout history, various texts and legends have described encounters with Asmodeus, each revealing something different about how people understood this demon and what he represented. Let's explore some of the most significant and revealing of these stories, because they show us how Asmodeus functioned as a character in the collective imagination. We've already discussed the story of Sarah and Tobias in detail, but it's worth emphasizing why this story had such staying power. It wasn't just about demonic possession or random evil. It was about a specific, relatable fear that something beyond your control could destroy your chance at happiness and love. Sarah did nothing wrong. She was innocent. Yet she suffered terribly and was blamed for something that wasn't her fault. This resonated deeply with people who felt that their own lives were affected by forces they couldn't understand or control, that misfortune seemed to follow them for no reason. The story also offered hope, though, because it showed that demonic power could be overcome through faith, divine assistance, and proper knowledge. Raphael, the angel of healing, provided the solution. The fish's organs, natural elements of creation, became weapons against the supernatural. And a marriage cursed by a demon became blessed and fruitful. The story said that evil, no matter how powerful, could be defeated. You weren't helpless. The Solomon stories took a different approach. In the Testament of Solomon, the king's power over demons came from God, channeled through the magical ring. Solomon didn't defeat Asmodeus through holiness alone, but through knowledge, understanding how the demon operated and what could counteract his influence. This reflected a very different attitude toward the supernatural, one where magic and religion overlapped, where knowing the right names, the right rituals, the right substances gave you power over spiritual entities. The alternate version, where Asmodeus tricks and replaces Solomon, served as a cautionary tale about pride and overconfidence. Solomon thought he had mastered the demons, had them under control, but he underestimated Asmodeus's cunning. The demon waited for an opportunity, exploited a moment of carelessness, and stole everything. The message was clear: never assume you've beaten temptation permanently. Never think you're so wise or so powerful that you're beyond corruption. The moment you become complacent is the moment evil strikes. In later Jewish folklore, particularly stories collected in texts like the alphabet of Ben Sura and various Talmudic tales, Asmodeus appears as a complex figure who sometimes almost seems playful or mischievous rather than purely evil. In one story, when forced to explain his actions, he argues that he only does what humans secretly want him to do. He claims that if humans truly resisted, he'd have no power. He positions himself almost as a mirror, reflecting humanity's own desires back at them in exaggerated form. There's a fascinating story where Asmodeus, while Solomon is away, sits on the throne and rules Israel. The rabbis who compiled this tale noted something interesting. During Asmodeus's reign, he kept all of Solomon's laws, ruled justly, and didn't lead the people into obvious sin. He was maintaining the illusion perfectly. This raises an unsettling question that the story deliberately provokes. If the demon could rule justly and no one could tell the difference from the wise king's rule, what does that say about the nature of leadership and authority? What does it say about how easy it is to fool people? In Christian mystical literature, particularly texts dealing with saints and spiritual warfare, Asmodeus appears as a tempter targeting holy people specifically. There are numerous accounts of monks and nuns being assaulted by lustful visions attributed to him. The Desert Fathers, early Christian hermits who went into the wilderness to pray and fast, described battles with demons who appeared to them, often in beautiful forms, trying to lure them back to worldly pleasures. While not always named specifically, the demon of lust who tormented these ascetics was understood to be Asmodeus or one of his legions. Saint Anthony the Great, one of the most famous Desert Fathers, was said to have been tormented by visions so intense that other monks could hear the sounds of battle from his cell. The demons he fought took many forms, sometimes appearing as beautiful women, sometimes as former friends, sometimes as manifestations of his own doubts and desires given physical form. These weren't quick temptations. They were prolonged psychological and spiritual warfare, lasting days or weeks, designed to break down his resistance through exhaustion and persistent assault. What's revealing about these stories is that they never suggest the holy people were immune to temptation. They felt the pull. They struggled. Anthony himself admitted that the visions affected him, that he had to fight not just the demons, but his own responses. The difference was that he didn't give in, and eventually, through prayer and faith, the assault would end. But it would return. These stories emphasized that spiritual warfare was constant, that demons like Asmodeus never gave up. They just waited for the next moment of weakness. Given how dangerous Asmodeus was considered to be, various traditions developed methods for protecting against him or driving him away if he'd already established influence over someone. These methods reveal what people believed about the nature of demonic power and how it could be counteracted. They also show us the deep anxiety that surrounded sexuality and desire in religious communities. The most basic protection was simply faithful marriage itself. The logic went like this. If Asmodeus's primary goal was to prevent proper sexual expression within marriage and encourage improper expression outside it, then a strong, faithful marriage was automatically a barrier against his influence. Husbands and wives who loved each other, who honored their vows, who expressed sexuality within the proper context, were protected by the very nature of their commitment. This wasn't just moral teaching. It was presented as a practical spiritual defense. The story of Tobias and Sarah provided a specific ritual that appeared in various forms across centuries. Burning certain substances, particularly organs from fish, created smoke that supposedly drove away Asmodeus specifically. This practice has roots in ancient incense traditions common across many cultures. Smoke was seen as a boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds, and certain scents had the power to repel evil entities. The fish organs in the Tobit story were probably specifically a fish from the Tigris River, and different interpreters suggested different species, but the principle remained the same. The right substance, properly burned, created an environment where the demon couldn't remain. This connects to broader traditions of using incense, blessed oils, and consecrated objects in exorcism and protection rituals. Catholic tradition developed elaborate rites involving holy water, blessed salt, prayers to specific saints, and invocations of divine names. When dealing specifically with lustful thoughts or temptations attributed to demonic influence, priests would often invoke Saint Joseph, who was considered the patron saint of chastity and purity, or the Virgin Mary, representing perfect virtue. The logic was that saints who had lived lives of exceptional sexual purity had particular power to intercede against demons of lust. Saint Michael the Archangel, the great warrior against Satan, was also invoked, particularly in the prayer that many Catholics still know. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. This prayer was used as a general protection, but was considered especially effective against powerful demons like Asmodeus. The idea was that while humans were weak, the angels were not, and calling on angelic assistance brought spiritual forces powerful enough to contend with infernal ones. Specific prayers and psalms were recommended for those dealing with lustful temptations. Psalm 51, the great penitential psalm beginning, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love," was frequently prescribed. It was a prayer of repentance, acknowledging sin and asking for cleansing and renewal. The act of praying it was supposed to realign the person's will with God's will, making them less vulnerable to demonic suggestion. Repeated prayer, particularly the rosary, was considered a powerful defense, creating a kind of spiritual shield through constant connection to the divine. Fasting and physical discipline were also recommended, particularly for religious people. The theory was that demons of lust exploited the body's appetites, so disciplining the body through fasting, sleeping less, abstaining from pleasures, created a state where those appetites had less power. This could become extreme, with some ascetics engaging in practices that modern people would recognize as harmful. But the underlying belief was that you had to master your body's desires before they mastered you, and opened the door to demonic influence. For cases where someone was believed to be actually possessed or heavily oppressed by Asmodeus, formal exorcism was required. The Roman ritual, the official book of rites for Catholic priests, included detailed instructions for exorcism that dated back centuries and were refined based on accumulated experience. These rituals involved multiple sessions, often requiring days or weeks. The exorcist would command the demon to identify itself, and if it named itself as Asmodeus, specific prayers and commands applied to him in particular. The exorcist would often ask when and how the demon gained entrance, trying to identify the sin or event that had opened the door. Had the person engaged in serious sexual sin? Had they used occult practices to seek forbidden knowledge or power? Had they rejected faith and invited demonic presence? Understanding the entrance point was believed to be crucial for closing that door permanently. Simply driving the demon out temporarily wasn't enough. The underlying cause had to be addressed, sins confessed and repented, broken relationships healed, and the person's life restructured to prevent reentry. Asmodeus didn't stay confined to religious texts and theological treatises. He became a character in literature, appearing in works that range from serious moral exploration to satire to pure entertainment. Tracing his literary appearances shows us how the demon evolved in the cultural imagination and what different eras found most interesting or frightening about him. One of the most significant literary appearances came in the 17th century with the Spanish novel El Diablo Cudlo, The Limping Devil, by Luis Valles de Guevara. In this satirical work, a student releases Asmodeus from a bottle where he'd been trapped, and the grateful demon offers to show the student the hidden sins of Madrid. They fly above the city at night, and Asmodeus lifts the roofs off houses, revealing what people do in private, the adultery, the greed, the hypocrisy. It's a sharp social satire, using the demon as a device to expose the gap between public virtue and private vice. This version of Asmodeus is witty, sardonic, and almost likable in his cynicism. He's not actively causing the sins he reveals. He's just showing what's already there, what people hide behind respectable facades. The novel was incredibly popular and inspired numerous imitations and adaptations, including a French version by Alain-René Lesage called Le Diable Boileau, which became even more famous than the original. This literary tradition transformed Asmodeus from a figure of terror into something more ambiguous, a knowledgeable outsider who understood human nature perhaps better than humans understood themselves. In the 19th century, Asmodeus appeared in various romantic and Gothic works that were fascinated by demonic figures as antiheroes or complex characters rather than simple villains. The Romantics were interested in passion, in desires that society condemned, in the individual against conventional morality. Asmodeus, the demon of desire, fit perfectly into these concerns. He became a symbol of forbidden knowledge and pleasure, of the price of passion, of the tension between societal rules and individual wants. Milton's Paradise Lost, while primarily focused on Satan and the fall of the angels, established a template for treating demons as complex characters with motivations, histories, and personalities. Later writers applied this approach to other demons, including Asmodeus. He appeared in various works as a fallen angel who remembered heaven, who felt the loss of grace, who struggled with his own nature. These were psychological portraits, using the demonic as a way to explore human psychology and moral complexity. In modern popular culture, Asmodeus has appeared in countless forms. He's a character in role-playing games, where he typically rules over a layer of hell and commands devils in an infernal hierarchy. He appears in television shows and movies about demons and the supernatural, often as a powerful antagonist or sometimes as an ambiguous figure who might help or hinder the protagonist depending on his own interests. He shows up in comic books, particularly those dealing with occult themes, where his traditional associations with lust and wrath are often updated for contemporary sensibilities. Video games have featured him as a boss character or a dark patron, someone who might grant power in exchange for service or souls. Novels in the urban fantasy and paranormal romance genres sometimes include him as a demon prince or king who interacts with human characters, often with the traditional lustful nature intact, but treated in various ways depending on the book's tone and themes. Some treat him as genuinely evil, a threat to be defeated. Others portray him as more morally ambiguous, pursuing his own goals that sometimes align with and sometimes conflict with human interests. What's interesting is that across all these modern appearances, certain core elements remain consistent. He's almost always powerful, high-ranking in whatever demonic hierarchy the work establishes. He's almost always associated with desire, temptation, and sexuality in some form. He's often portrayed as sophisticated, intelligent, and cunning rather than as a mindless brute. And there's frequently an element of tragic backstory. The fallen angel who remembers what he lost, the being who wanted something pure but became corrupted, the entity trapped by his own nature. These modern interpretations reflect contemporary attitudes towards sexuality and desire that are very different from medieval ones. While historical texts treated sexual desire outside very narrow bounds as inherently sinful and destructive, modern works often portray desire itself as neutral, something that can be expressed in healthy or unhealthy ways, but isn't intrinsically evil. Asmodeus in these contexts sometimes becomes a symbol of society's hypocritical attitudes towards sex, or of the danger of repressing natural urges, rather than of the danger of sexual sin itself. So what do we make of all this? Is Asmodeus just a relic of ancient superstition, a character from old books with no relevance to modern understanding? Or does the figure represent something deeper, something that remains true about human psychology and social dynamics regardless of whether we believe in literal demons? Let's explore what Asmodeus symbolizes and why his story has persisted for thousands of years. At the most basic level, Asmodeus represents the recognition that sexual desire can be destructive when it becomes obsessive or is expressed inappropriately. Every culture has some concept of this. The specific moral frameworks differ. What's considered appropriate varies widely across time and place, but the core observation remains that desire can override judgment, that people do genuinely destructive things when consumed by passion, that jealousy and possessiveness can turn violent. The 7 dead husbands in the book of Tobit aren't random. They represent real outcomes, how sexual jealousy has led to violence throughout human history. From a psychological perspective, Asmodeus embodies what Jung would call a shadow aspect, the parts of ourselves we don't want to acknowledge but that have power over us precisely because we deny them. Everyone has experienced attraction, desire, jealousy, and possessiveness to some degree. When we pretend these feelings don't exist or that we're completely in control of them, we actually become more vulnerable to acting on them unconsciously. By personifying these drives as an external demon, the medieval system actually created a way to acknowledge them, to say, yes, these impulses exist, they're powerful, they're dangerous, and we need strategies to manage them. The concept of demonic temptation allowed people to distinguish between having a thought or feeling and acting on it. The fact that Asmodeus might whisper lustful thoughts didn't mean you were evil. It meant you were human and under attack. Sin only occurred when you entertained those thoughts, nurtured them, and eventually acted on them. This created a framework for understanding the gap between impulse and choice, between being tempted and yielding to temptation. That's actually a fairly sophisticated psychological model. The association of Asmodeus with wrath, in addition to lust, is particularly insightful. Modern psychology recognizes that sexual behavior and aggression are linked in complex ways in the brain. Both involve strong emotions, both can override rational thinking, and both can be triggered by feelings of possession and territoriality. The medieval observation that the demon of lust was also a demon of wrath reflects genuine insight into how these drives interact. Crimes of passion, where someone kills a partner or rival in jealous rage, are examples of exactly what Asmodeus was said to cause. The story of the 7 husbands also speaks to something we'd now recognize as trauma and stigma. Sarah was traumatized by witnessing 7 deaths, was blamed by her community, and was considered cursed. Modern readers might interpret the story as being about how trauma and social stigma can make it nearly impossible for someone to have healthy relationships. The demon preventing consummation might be understood psychologically as severe anxiety or PTSD, making intimacy impossible. The magical solution Tobias uses might represent finding the right therapeutic approach, the right support, the right conditions for healing. Sociologically, the Asmodeus mythology served important functions in communities. It provided a language for discussing sexual ethics without explicitly describing sexual acts, which was useful in contexts where such direct discussion was taboo. Parents could teach children about dangers and appropriate behavior using stories about demons rather than graphic details. Communities could address problems of adultery, sexual violence, or obsession by framing them in terms everyone understood through shared religious knowledge. The demon also functioned as what anthropologists call a boundary marker, defining what was inside acceptable behavior and what was outside it. By personifying certain desires and acts as demonic, communities created a clear line. Not everyone agreed exactly where that line should be. Theological debates raged about specifics, but the framework itself was widely shared. This created social cohesion around sexual norms, for better or worse, by making violations not just rule-breaking but cosmic evil, attacks from supernatural forces of darkness. Modern readers might see the rigid sexual ethics that the Asmodeus mythology supported as oppressive, particularly toward women, who were often blamed for men's desires and faced severe consequences for any sexual activity outside very narrow acceptable bounds. The fact that Sarah was mocked and blamed for her husband's death, despite being completely innocent, reflects real patterns of how women were treated when anything sexually irregular occurred around them. The demon mythology could be weaponized to control and punish. But it's also worth noting that the same mythology could be protective in some ways. By insisting that sexual activity belonged only in faithful marriage, it theoretically provided a framework where women had rights and protections. A man who abandoned his wife for another woman could be framed as yielding to demonic temptation, making his behavior morally condemnable. The system was deeply flawed and often hypocritical. Men frequently faced fewer consequences than women for the same behaviors, but it did at least create language for saying some sexual behaviors were wrong, which could sometimes protect vulnerable people. One question we haven't directly addressed yet is, did people actually believe Asmodeus was real? It's a more complicated question than it might seem, because belief exists on a spectrum and means different things to different people. Let's explore how various groups throughout history approached the question of whether this demon literally existed and what that belief meant for how they lived. For ancient and medieval believers, the answer was generally yes. Demons, including Asmodeus, were considered absolutely real. They were as real as angels, as real as God, as real as the physical world. The universe was understood as having multiple layers, the material world visible to the senses, and spiritual realms inhabited by various entities, both good and evil. Demons weren't metaphors. They were actual beings with their own existence, intelligence, and agency. They could interact with the physical world, influence human thoughts and actions, and would face judgment along with humans at the end of time. This wasn't considered superstition or primitive thinking by the people who held these beliefs. It was their cosmology, their understanding of how reality worked, based on scriptural texts, church teaching, theological reasoning, and reported experiences. When someone experienced overwhelming lustful thoughts that seemed to come from nowhere, that felt foreign to their normal way of thinking, attributing them to demonic influence wasn't irrational within that framework. It was the obvious explanation. External supernatural forces affecting internal states made perfect sense if you believed such forces existed and had the ability and motivation to act on humans. The instructions for protection and exorcism were taken completely seriously. These weren't just comforting rituals. They were practical techniques believed to have real effects in the spiritual realm that would manifest in the physical realm. When a priest performed an exorcism, he genuinely believed he was commanding an actual entity to depart. When someone burned fish organs following the method from Tobit, they expected actual results. The demon would be unable to remain and would flee. If the method didn't work, it meant something had been done incorrectly or the person's faith was insufficient, not that the method itself was invalid. However, even within traditional belief, there were always people who approached these matters with more nuance or skepticism. Some medieval theologians debated the exact nature of demonic influence. How much was direct action by demons, and how much was simply humans' own evil impulses that we blamed on external forces? Some questioned whether every temptation required an actual demon or whether most sin came from internal corruption, original sin working itself out in each person. These debates got quite sophisticated, involving questions of free will, the nature of evil, and the mechanics of how immaterial beings could affect material ones. Magicians and occultists who worked with grimoires like the Lesser Key of Solomon had a complex relationship with belief. On one hand, they accepted that entities like Asmodeus existed and could be summoned. On the other hand, their goal was to command and control these entities, treating them more like forces of nature that could be mastered through proper technique than like monsters to be feared. This approach sometimes led to skepticism about the religious framing. If you could control a demon with the right ritual, was it really an agent of ultimate evil, or just another part of the hidden structure of reality? As the Enlightenment brought scientific thinking and skepticism about supernatural claims, educated people increasingly reinterpreted demonic lore psychologically or dismissed it entirely. Asmodeus wasn't a literal entity, but a symbol of human lust. Possession wasn't demonic, but a mental illness. Exorcism didn't drive out evil spirits, but had psychological effects on disturbed people. This view became dominant in secular culture and among many religious people who maintained faith, but rejected supernatural elements that seemed incompatible with scientific understanding. Today, belief in literal demons varies widely. Conservative religious communities, both Christian and Islamic, often maintain traditional beliefs about demonic entities as real beings. Many people have personal experiences they interpret as spiritual warfare or demonic attack. Others view demons as purely metaphorical, useful symbols for discussing evil and temptation, but not actual entities. Still others reject the framework entirely, seeing it as an outdated way of understanding psychological and social phenomena. What's interesting is that the stories and symbols retain power even for people who don't believe in literal demons. The name Asmodeus still evokes something, a particular flavor of temptation and destruction. The stories still resonate as explorations of human weakness and the consequences of uncontrolled desire. The figure serves a literary and cultural function even divorced from literal belief. We can analyze the symbol without settling the metaphysical question. So, where does all this leave us in understanding Asmodeus, the demon of lust and wrath? Whether we interpret him as a literal supernatural entity, a psychological symbol, a cultural construct, or some combination of these, several insights emerge from tracing his story across millennia. First, the figure of Asmodeus reveals deep human anxiety about desire and control. The fear that passion might override reason, that we might want things we shouldn't want, that our desires might destroy what we value. These are universal concerns that transcend any particular religious or cultural framework. Every person grapples with the question of how to handle powerful drives that can lead in destructive directions if not properly managed. Asmodeus personifies that struggle, making it something we can talk about, a story about, and develop strategies for addressing. Second, the evolution of Asmodeus from the Persian fury demon Aeshma through the jealous demon of Tobit to the medieval demon of lust and prince of hell shows how myths adapt and transform as they move between cultures and across time. Each version reflects the concerns of the people telling the story. Ancient Persians feared chaotic violence. Hellenistic Jews faced questions about suffering and divine justice. Medieval Christians developed complex systems for categorizing and resisting sin. Modern people explore psychology and symbolic meaning. The demon changes to address changing human concerns while maintaining core elements that give him continuity and recognizability. Third, the Asmodeus stories consistently emphasize that destructive desire isn't just about physical acts, but about internal states that lead to those acts. The demon works through temptation, suggestion, and the gradual corruption of normal feelings into obsessive, destructive ones. This is actually a sophisticated understanding of how people end up doing things they never thought they'd do. It's rarely a sudden decision. It's a progression, small compromises building on each other, until suddenly you're somewhere you never intended to be. The mythology provides a framework for recognizing that progression before it goes too far. Fourth, the various protection and resistance methods, whether we view them as literally effective or psychologically helpful, all involve similar elements: awareness, intentional choice, community support, connection to something transcendent, and specific practices that reinforce boundaries. These are actually evidence-based approaches to managing temptation and addiction, even from a secular psychological perspective. The religious framing provided motivation and structure for what were, in many cases, genuinely helpful behavioral strategies. Fifth, the danger in the Asmodeus mythology isn't just what it says about desire, but also how it was weaponized, particularly against women, to enforce rigid social control and punish anyone who didn't conform to narrow norms. Any powerful symbol can be misused. The same story that helped some people resist destructive impulses was used to condemn others for completely natural feelings or to blame victims for crimes committed against them. We can appreciate the psychological insights in the mythology while also recognizing the harm caused by its misapplication. And finally, The enduring fascination with Asmodeus reveals something about storytelling and human nature. We're drawn to figures that embody our struggles, that externalize internal conflicts, that give names and faces to abstract concepts. Whether demon, symbol, or literary character, Asmodeus serves that function powerfully. He makes visible the invisible, gives form to the formless, and lets us explore dangerous territory safely through narrative. The 7 dead husbands lying in their marriage beds, killed by jealous rage. The demon bound in Egypt, restrained but not destroyed. The beautiful woman suffering from a curse she didn't deserve. King Solomon was tricked and replaced by the creature he thought he'd mastered. The hermit saints battling visions in the desert night. These images stick in the mind because they capture something true about the human condition, about desire and danger, about temptation and resistance, about the constant negotiation between what we want and what we should do. Asmodeus endures because the questions he represents are eternal. How do we handle powerful desires? When does healthy attraction become unhealthy obsession? How do we protect relationships from the forces, internal or external, that would destroy them? How do we maintain integrity when tempted? How do we forgive ourselves when we fail? These aren't ancient questions that modern people have moved beyond. They're the same questions every generation faces, just in new contexts with new details. So whether you see Asmodeus as a literal demon, a powerful metaphor, or an interesting artifact of cultural history, his story offers insights worth considering. The ancient writers who developed this mythology were observing real patterns in human behavior and trying to make sense of them. Their explanatory framework involved supernatural entities, which you may or may not accept. But the patterns they observed remain. The destructive potential of uncontrolled desire, the connection between lust and rage, the way obsession can destroy lives, the importance of boundaries and self-control, the possibility of redemption and restoration. And isn't that ultimately what mythology is supposed to do? Not just entertain us with interesting stories, though Asmodeus's tales are certainly that, but help us understand ourselves and the world we inhabit, give us frameworks for thinking about difficult questions, provide warnings about potential dangers and guidance for avoiding them, create shared language and concepts that let communities discuss important matters. The demon of lust and wrath has been doing exactly that for over 2,000 years, evolving with each telling but maintaining his essential nature. And he'll likely continue doing so as long as humans struggle with desire and need stories to help them make sense of that struggle. If you found this exploration of Asmodeus fascinating and want to dive deeper into other figures from demonology, mythology, and folklore, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. We've got so many more incredible stories coming your way, creatures and entities from cultures around the world, beings that terrified and fascinated our ancestors and continue to captivate us today. Drop a comment below telling me which demon, monster, or mythological figure you want to learn about next. And if you made it all the way to the end of this deep dive, thank you. It means a lot that you spent this time exploring these ancient mysteries with me. Until next time, stay curious about the stories that shaped human culture. And remember, the most powerful myths are the ones that speak to something eternally true about what it means to be human.